Hi, I'm Erin Marcus, former corporate executive turned entrepreneur and founder and CEO of Conquer Your Business. Welcome to the Ready Yet podcast. We're excited to bring you more than 100 episodes of interviews and insights designed to help entrepreneurs get the financial and emotional freedom they need in order to build a business and a life they're proud of. All right. Welcome to this episode of the Ready Yet podcast, where my guest, Mark Silver, and I have finally stopped talking about working in our gardens and want to talk to you. You thought you were coming to learn about business, but you were actually coming to learn about how to remove invasive species from the forest without upsetting the baby squirrels. That's what we're really talking about today.
That is exactly right.
That's how we do it. But before we get into all of that, why don't you tell everybody who you are and what you do?
All right. Well, my name is Mark Silver. I'm the founder of Heart of Business. And for the last 24 years, we've worked with over 4,500 business owners. We exist at the intersection of social justice, small business, and spirituality. And I have my Masters of Divinity. I practice within a Sufi tradition that I learned from my sheikh, who passed in 2015. He was a Palestinian from Jerusalem who taught at Al-Aqsa, the masjid there. And I'm currently fasting for Ramadan. That's what's happening. And so all of this kind of comes together to say that every act of business can be an act of love. That's really what we're about. And I published a book recently, which is worth talking about, Heart-Centered Business, Healing from Toxic Business Culture so your small business can thrive. And I'll laugh and say, when I met somebody and they went back to talk to their team, somebody on their team said, "Oh, Mark Silver, he's the OG of ethical business." So I
there
laughed
you go,
about
the OG
that.
of that's your title. You got to put that on your Zoom. OG of ethical business.
Exactly. So
I love it.
I like to have fun. I like to see businesses fly, especially in the face of capitalism and the toxicity of it, and I like to see us all working towards something more beautiful.
And I think one of the things, I have so many questions and so many things I think there's been a shift in the energy. I want to say personally, I felt it starting in about October of last year, that the hustle culture from the 80s, the striving culture from the 90s, we've hit, that was okay then. That was the reach then. That was the expansion then. But there's...
I grew up in the 80s. It wasn't
so did
good
I.
then. It wasn't good
so
then
did I.
But
it was different than the 50s, where you just handed something and you settled for whatever you were given. Yeah. So the next iteration was creating, striving for more, right? As opposed to what you were handed. But I do think it's interesting to me, I always feel that if there's pushback, it's because that pushback is coming from a fear of wanting to keep the status quo. So when you see more and more pushback, you're seeing, the status quo is changing. And I feel like we have this separation now of more and more people in small business and even some large businesses who see that there's a different way to do it. They see that there is I'll call it a better way, because my opinion is there's a better way to do it, a more conscientious way to do this. And yet at the same time, we're seeing stories of large companies doubling down on the crappy behavior. Literally doubling down on the crappy behavior as a pushback to the movement of doing it a better way.
Yes.
Which to me is a good indication, right? Because it means you wouldn't push back against it if you didn't feel you needed to.
Right. It's true. And my personal opinion is that we're in this, kind of end stage capitalism.
People yell at me when I call it that, because I'm a big believer in so much of capitalism, but my boyfriend gets all up at me. I'm calling what's going on now endgame capitalism. And everyone's and I'm like,
Well, and it's like I don't think a lot of folks know what I mean, when people talk about capitalism in this way, because capitalism is not trade and commerce. It's not business. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is new for the last few hundred years. There's been trade and commerce and what people sometimes call indirect bartering or using some kind of currency for thousands and thousands of years. And it's looked 1,000 million different ways across the planet. What we've seen over the last few hundred years is a very toxic colonialist, white supremacist, sexist, capitalist, toxic stew that has concentrated the ownership of the of
Resources,
everything,
right, of
of
resources.
resources into very few hands. And that's really what capitalism is about. It's about the centralization of control of resources instead of allowing a real diversity of a healthy ecosystem, a healthy economy to thrive in many, many, many diverse ways. And it's toxic, and it can only last so long because it feeds on everything.
Well, so right, and so one of the things that I do is my version of spirituality is Mother Nature. Like that's my version. For you can agree or not agree, but that's what I go back to, right? The natural world. What happens in the natural world? Because things ebb and flow. There's symbiotic relationships that when they're left to exist, work wonderfully. You have different animals eat different things, eat different animals. There's a lot of them. There's a little bit of those. And so when I see what's happening in our created world, if the more it moves away from mirroring the natural world, you start to see there's problems.
Yeah, exactly. Because it is the natural world. Like it's not like we exist outside the natural world. We're animals too, right? And so by creating a system that ignores the healthy limits in the natural world, you create a system that is inevitably going to fall to pieces, and do a lot of damage in the process. We see this with invasive species in
Right.
nature. It's
That's
like
what we were talking about before we
exactly
had to have this
they'll
conversation.
they'll expand to the point where they collapse. They
Where they
you know
collapse the system.
where they collapse themselves
Yeah.
too, right? Because there's nothing left to feed on. It's interesting because at Horn Farm here, York County in Pennsylvania, regenerative agriculture center for regenerative agriculture, where I've learned so much from them. Someone was explaining that like a meadow is a competitive environment. Everything's struggling and fighting for limited resources. But a woodland, a forest, is a cooperative environment. Everything is operating together and supporting each other and communicating. And what we see is that meadows, when left alone, become woodland.
Mhm.
That's what they do. They just naturally succeed into woodland. I think that like the natural state of things is cooperation, is caring for each other, is sharing resources. And you know i I have an ultimate hopefulness. I just hope that we can get there as a species without doing as
Too
much
much damage.
damage.
Well,
Yeah.
and here's the thing, I also don't know, because I agree, like you don't want the damage being done, but the change is inevitable, and the change isn't always bad.
Mhm.
Oftentimes the catalyst is hard, right? Catalyst, things don't change because they're happy, and puppies and rainbows and unicorns seldom, invoke change. But the catalyst is hard, but the outcome isn't necessarily a bad one.
Right. Right. The challenge, of course, is in this culture, the people who are going to take the brunt of it are the most
Yeah,
vulnerable.
right.
That's really like, it's, I mean, we live pretty rurally, not terribly rurally, but enough that we have some acres around us and woods and animals and things. And it's like, we let one of our neighbors hunt our land during deer
Mhm.
season. And, you know, things die, things eat each other. Like that essence of like just the life, the cycle of life and death doesn't bother me. It's just when we've set up a system so that it's the vulnerable among us that are going to take the biggest brunt. And that's what I find the most painful. And it doesn't have to be that way. What I love about working in small business, and that really fires me up, and I haven't gotten bored in 23, 24 years, um, is that there's so much possibility for good.
Yeah.
When you have lots of small businesses that know each other, and we can weave a tapestry of mutual aid and support. There's so much good that can come out of that. There's,
I
much
think that's
creativity.
I was at a meeting. It was the last meeting I was at before the lockdowns happened. And there's probably 150 people there. And 149 of them were entrepreneurs. And I don't know how the other person got there or who she knew, like why she came. And at the end of the day, as people were sharing their ahas and their as those types of events tend to do, she stood up and she said, in a million years, I've never seen anything like this. A room overflowing with people who, down to the last one of them, wants to know who they can help and how they can help. And that was it. And like, to me, coming out of corporate, I noticed corporate is inherently competitive, right? Because you have 100 people on the team, 5 get promoted, then 2 get promoted, then 1 it's inherently competitive.
Right.
But to your point, with small business, there's so much more opportunity. So how do you explain to the naysayer who will say, oh, you're complaining about capitalism, but that's how you make money? Because I agree with you, that's not how we make money. That's not why we get to make money. How does a small business thrive in this larger chaotic environment?
Yeah, they can thrive very well. So the way we do it is the way we need to do it as human beings, is through community. We have to, the more that we can make actual genuine relationships with other small business owners and with other people in the community. Everything in life is relationship. It's our relationship, our
Yeah.
heart's relationship to, in my point of view as a Sufi, to the source of love. And everything is an expression of the source of love. And so I'm wanting to be, in Allah, the divine, wanting to be in connection, in relationship with everything in that sense. And when I can, through my business, be in relationship both to people that I can help and people who can help me and people we can just also just be a network, a tapestry of support. That's where the thriving is. And I want to say, you don't have to be an extrovert. I'm talking about relationship and knowing all
Yes.
these people. Like, you don't have to be an extrovert. There's so
It
many
doesn't
different
mean
ways to
running
do
around
relationship.
screaming on the top of your lungs to everyone who listen.
No, no,
Yes.
it doesn't. It doesn't. And it doesn't mean having to spend a tremendous amount of time with lots of other people if that's not your thing. But we do need relationships. And weaving those relationships comes from a combination of sovereignty and strength in ourselves, like developing a confidence and a clarity in who we are, which I think also arises out of a humility, because when we know our gifts, that usually brings us to a place of humility. It's when we don't know our gifts that people sometimes think they have to puff themselves up to
Right.
pretend there's something they're not. But when you just know yourself, there's an ability to just be humble. And then a combination of that with vulnerability. Vulnerability is, I think, the master quality in life and in business. Without vulnerability, we can't let anything new in. Without vulnerability, we can't make new relationships. And without vulnerability, we're walled off from the world around us. And there's no real way to succeed except through force, which isn't, in my book, success.
Well, and the other thing that I see happen, you're talking about vulnerability, humility, like the authenticity, right? If we label it authenticity, one of the things I see happen when you don't have those traits, when you're not confident in your authenticity, when you're not confident in your gifts, to your point, you become susceptible to other people's marketing, to other people's highlight
Yes,
reels, to other people's version of success. And I don't say those people aren't bad, by the way, they're doing their job, right? They're they don't have to be bad for this to not work for you. They
right,
might just be good at marketing, right?
right,
It doesn't have to be bad or wrong.
right.
But what happens is I watch, and I've done this. I'm looking at where I've done it time and time again. When that's your motivation and that's your guide, it doesn't work,
It
right?
doesn't
That's
work.
the chasing. That's the grasping. That's the chasing. That's the striving. That's the making decisions based on underlying stories as opposed to connection.
Yes, I agree.
And it's brutal, right?
It is. It is brutal.
It's
It's
brutal
so
because
terrible for our mental health. It's so brutal
it's
for our
it's
hearts.
heartbreaking.
It
It's
is.
heartbreaking because I can see brilliant, wonderful people, or when I've experienced it myself,
Yeah.
like feeling like, okay, I get it now. That's how you do this. Not realizing that that will never come externally.
Right. It's so interesting because it does come externally. I this whole there was a meme going around social media. I guess it makes its rounds. It's like, you know, you can't, you know, be loved until you learn how to love yourself. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I think we do learn how to love ourselves through the genuine love of others. Like how else does it, it's like I think there's a give and a take. One of the things that I think is very important that I teach a lot on is to not prioritize the inner over the outer. If we prioritize the inner over the outer, there's kind of an assumption there that somehow the inner is more sacred and the outer is not sacred.
Mm.
And that's how we got into this mess, this dumpster fire of a culture in the first place, is by not treating the outer as sacred and holy and beautiful. And when someone cares for me, whether it's my wife or a friend or my kids or whoever, when someone cares for me, I learn a little bit more about how to care for myself. And when I can care for myself, then and I strengthen that, then I can bring that to other people. So I think there's a give and a take. I don't want anyone to feel like they have to become some version of enlightened before
Well,
they can operate in the world.
yes, absolutely. And any great thing, I say this about people, your best quality is always your worst quality, right? Like that's your greatest strength is always your biggest weakness. And I think to what you're saying, the people taken too far, focusing on the inner ends up being to the exclusion of others. And
Yes.
that's not what we're looking for.
Yeah, there's a balance. The Sufis talk about the middle way. It's like they say that we progress on two wings, the wing of hope and the wing of fear. The wing of hope is a beautiful medicine. My sheikh called hope a medicine. Like we need hope, but too much hope and we end up living in fantasy land. We
Right.
end up, ungrounded. We end up like disconnected from reality. We become heedless of the cliff edge, and we fall off. Fear is actually a really important quality. It's a really important thing for us to pay attention to because it keeps us awake. It keeps us like sometimes fear is real. Like sometimes there's a real danger or something that we need to be awake to or something we need to pay attention to. But too much fear and we become paralyzed. We become small. We become very like insular and we aren't. And so like the hope and the fear and this middle way with both is such a I find such a more balanced, healthy way forward.
So how does somebody use this to guide them?
So what we want to do is we want to I always say to clients, like whatever, and myself many times,
Always starts there.
is that whatever you've been leaning into, try leaning into the other. So for instance, I had a client who was working really hard at their marketing, working really hard, doing all the right things. Really, I looked at it, I'm like, you're doing all the right things, but something wasn't clicking. And I'm like, so what's not happening? So I said, let's lean into the inner. And I asked them to stop and to go into their heart, and I guided them into their heart and supported them, and just like they were just started just asking in their heart and opening, and just, and suddenly a workshop that they were trying to sell filled up. They need a larger room. Now that's an unusual experience. I mean, that's big. Some,
You're not
but
promising those results
not,
every time.
but there, like, there is that factor that's
Yeah.
real. But then there's the other side where I've seen people like coming to me going, "Oh my God, I have some issue with receiving, and I've been working on it spiritually and emotionally, and I just can't make it." I'm like, how's your marketing message? How's it?
When's the last time you posted?
Do you know how
Did
to
you
do you know
call
how to
somebody?
do you know how to do a sales conversation effectively? And like,
So true.
and so as I teach them the outer pieces and they put that into place, they realize like, okay, so maybe they do have an issue with receiving, but it wasn't as big as they thought. As they start getting clients and money starts to
They
flow.
have an
So
issue with actually doing,
yeah.
right?
So, and so it's just focused on the wrong thing. So it's like if you find yourself more focused on one, like, if like, and we all have our habits and the things that we go to, and notice where you spend most of your time and try spending it in this other place, try backing off from that.
I absolutely love that because so one of the tools that I like to use, I call it putting bumpers in my gutters.
Mhm.
And so I try to, what's the extreme ends of the situation and how, because, success is not a straight line. We kind of wiggle our way forward, right? We bounce our way forward. My goal is to get my bumpers close enough together. So when the pendulum swings back and forth, it doesn't pick up enough momentum to crush me when it hits me, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly, but your example is exactly what I saw happen in my business is last year, I had a brilliant plan. On paper, it was phenomenal. We did so many things, so many things. It did not work the way that any of us on the team saw it work. Like it just didn't work the way we wanted it to work. And when we pulled the plug on it, I definitely swung to the other side and went way, way, way internally. And now that the pendulum got a little too far out of control. But now that we're getting back to your middle ground, it can feel so authentic and connecting and easy
Mhm. Yes.
and light.
Yes. Yes. And I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's even desirable to find like the perfect balance. You're not saying this, but I just wanted to highlight that like the perfect balance point doesn't, we do kind of wiggle, like even walking, like we sway
Like
back and
waddle.
forth,
I'm
it's
only
got
five feet tall. I waddle more than
and
most.
the little
Right?
little hip action is good to like move yourself forward, and it's healthier for your body. And so we don't want to just find the stasis point and stay
Yeah.
there, because that's stagnancy. There's going to be times where we do more. It's like, again, with the natural world, if you're, we have all this hickory on our property, and the hickory nuts drop in the fall, and I'm collecting the hickory nuts and
You're rolling
cracking
it.
them
Are they as bad
and
as the
cooking them.
black walnuts here where you like roll an ankle walking around?
No, 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 no. They're smaller and they're much tastier. But then once they're all cracked and put away, then there's time for rest, right? It's like the harvest, and then the
Yes.
planting, and then the times between. I think that we have that piece. I mean, this piece we were talking about a little bit before we started recording, is like the hustle culture. Hustle culture says you must amp it up to here and then live here all the
Right.
time.
You're right. Meanwhile, my nervous system is having a absolute
Fried,
breakdown.
totally fried. Cannot do that. And Sometimes there's work to do. Sometimes you do have to push a little. But even when you're pushing, we can stay connected to our heart, and we can be aware that, oh, this is not permanent. This is just a project. And when this project is over, there's time for rest. And we shouldn't live there. But sometimes we can go there
Have to
and
be
then
there,
come back.
right? You can visit.
Right.
Well,
Right.
and the other part of it is with the whole analogy with the natural world that I try to remind myself, sometimes our business is in winter and things
Yes.
just aren't growing. Like
Right.
things are buried here. We had 2.5 feet of snow in 36 hours. So right late in January, but it was the only like sometimes the business is going through winter, and it doesn't mean you don't do work on it. But I love the idea of don't make it a failure, don't make it wrong, don't beat yourself up for going through, right? If you're going through hard times, what do? You got to keep going, right? Like don't wallow in the winter, right? Seasonal depression,
Right. Right. And you can develop a business to the point where the low tide and the high tide, to switch metaphors on you, where the low tide is still high enough to float you,
Yes,
you know,
yes,
that's what we're really trying to do. We're not
absolutely.
going to get rid of the ups and downs, but you can develop a business so that the low tide is still floating you. And even if we stick with the trees, like the trees are still nourishing themselves
Right.
during the winter.
They're
It's
not
just
dying.
different. Yeah,
Yeah,
they're not dying.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So how did you get to do this? What made you go this route?
So it was the natural next step after being a paramedic in Oakland,
Clearly,
California.
like no, there was no other path that could have happened. It's so
No, it couldn't.
obvious.
No, so I got burnt out on being a medic and in the 911 system in the Bay Area. And I had also been volunteering for a nonprofit magazine. I was the managing editor for the small nonprofit magazine. And I'd learned enough about marketing growing up. And we had friends who were self-employed, organic gardeners and other people. And they're like, oh, this was the 90s. Can you help me with my trifold brochure, if you remember those?
I
And as a
did.
world's worst designer, but I knew something about business, evidently. And so I just started helping people, and I knew more than I thought I did. And then that intersected with Sufi healing. And because I'd been an activist, I'd had a passion for social justice since I was a teenager, and Rock Against Reagan in DC, in the DC punk scene. And so, we this all kind of came together and turned into Heart of Business. And it's been a very surprising journey because it's not something I could have mapped out, but it's been absolutely beautiful. I One of the big things that happened for me when I was starting to study with the Sufis and learning spiritual healing, learning business healing in particular, because one of the teachers there was a business consultant who was adapting it to business healing, was that I was seeing that there were these really esoteric spiritual teachings that mapped onto business practice, some business practice that had integrity. And I'm like, oh, marketing can actually be healing if
Right.
it's done a certain way, and instead of being toxic. And so, yeah, and so that started to kind of seep into my work. And I've created an entire body of work around this, where we have access to love. It's not like a spirituality where you kind of go fill your tank with spirituality and then you go do
Then
business
you
and
go
run
to
dry
work.
and then go back.
Exactly.
It's like, no, the work itself that has the love infused in it so that it can really nourish us as we
Love it.
go.
Love it. So if people want to learn more about that and continue this conversation with you and learn about invasive species and how to chop down, how to clear land without bothering babies, girls and birds, we're having the same problem here.
Yeah, no.
What is the
Brush
best
cutter. You want a brush cutter? We got the
I'm
battery operated one.
I
So
am literally going through an acre of forest and individually choosing things.
yes, yes.
This is not a shortcut.
No, it's not. It's
But
not. It's
there's
not, but it's
no nest,
healthier.
right? There's
So
no nests. There's no babies in there.
right.
Yes, but
So
how do they get a hold of you? How can they find you?
heartofbusiness.com. On our homepage, there's a place where you can get the first chapter to my book.
Oh,
If you want to
nice.
see it, you can just check out who we are, get on our email list. You can also find me on Facebook or LinkedIn, and
All the social
yeah, the socials.
throughout the
And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing your energy and your insights and your experience and your trees and your metaphors. You talk like I do. So awesome. But thank you so much for joining me here.
I'm so delighted. Thank you for holding the space that you do.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Ready Yet podcast. I truly enjoy bringing these stories of success and inspiration to you. Please join us in our mission to empower entrepreneurs to be in charge of their businesses and in charge of their lives by sharing this with anyone you know who would benefit from our tactical and motivating advice, leaving us a review, and letting us know if there are any particular topics you would really appreciate hearing about. See you next time.